Welcome to Punk Divided, a look at how the fashion of punk, in its clothing, music, and ideals, were a representation of the political and social ideation in East and West Berlin during a time of social unrest and government suppression. Following World War II, the Allies that fought to defeat the German Nazi regime divided the dismantled nation into 4 occupation zones. The East went to the Soviet Union, while the West was split between the United States, Great Britain, and France. Berlin, the capital of the country, located deep in the Eastern Territory, was divided in a similar fashion. By 1961, the ruling Soviet Socialist Party, the SED, decided to officially stop emigration from the East and began erecting the Berlin Wall. A 12-foot reinforced concrete barrier became a symbol of the Cold War era and division between capitalism and communism. Guard towers, heavy artillery, and strict surveillance kept Eastern inhabitants from accessing the West. The punk genre, which came to fruition at the height of these political tensions, first saw its roots in Great Britain and America in the late 1970s. A movement that presented as an escape from mainstream rock and roll music was an attempt to bring authenticity and danger back into the scene. The blaring and aggressive sound became the starting point for a full-blown culture that would develop to rebel against the conventions of traditional society. Most notably defined by the aggressive outward appearance, fashion was a crucial distinction of punk, marked by ripped jeans, leather jackets, and styled hair, adorned with safety pins, chains, and spikes. A back-to-basics revolt against big production set the scene for deconstructed DIY looks with hand painting and patchwork that communicated punk attitudes. Punk quickly infiltrated West Germany. American and British media flowing into those allied sectors meant that records and magazines with the style crossed the channel and caught the eye of already unsettled Germans. The idea of rebellion and societal rejection was appealing to many who were living through the uncertainty of the Cold War. West Germans took punk ideals and transformed the music by singing in their native language about the excitement and frustrations of living in a divided country. DEUTSCHEPUNK became a blend of sound and rhythm fueled by a unique angst and confusion that was not encapsulated in the American and British bands. Eventually, this concept made its way to the East. Despite limited contact between West and East Germans during the early years of division, punk still found its way through the Iron Curtain. First came the sound of DEUTSCHEPUNK, since radio transmissions could not be stopped by the Soviet state, and later anti-West propaganda attempted to depict the unnecessary decadence of capitalism by using images of punks. No surprise, these pictures actually had the opposite effect. And so, anarchy quickly took hold of the East. The depiction of deviance and untraditional styles was appealing to those who felt trapped by socialist ideals. A platform for politically charged commentary and a style supported by do-it-yourself ethos was alluring, and a place where consumer suppression was one of the most notable issues. Eastern youth were quick to take on the rebellious fashion. Fashion is an art that relies on both creation and consumption. Through observing, constructing, and wearing, the consumer becomes entangled with the creator. This allowed those caught in the turmoil of political and social division to engage in a physical and emotional expression. We can trace this concept through the developments of punk clothing in East and West Berlin. Despite having found ways to express their ideals, the politically fueled music was a concern for the SED, and the secret police went undercover to infiltrate the scene. Eastern punks were often watched, targeted, brutally arrested, or even expelled to the West for their defiance against the state. Punk in the GDR required some imagination. Hair coloring often came from fountain pen ink, clothing was made from curtains and pieced together garments, accessories were stolen items, like chains from scrap yards, making the wild adornments they had in Western fashions pretty rare. This gave the style of Eastern punk a more genuine authenticity to its look, bred out of pure necessity. The most notable aspect of punk clothing was symbols and sayings sprawled across tees and leather jackets. It was a key element that differentiated East and West. Westerners and their desire for scandal led to the use of profane and even Nazi-related symbols without taking into account their true political and historical meaning. Vivienne Westwood was a prominent punk designer who took on this trend and was later criticized for it. Meanwhile, punks in the East never used such explicit imagery and were cautious not to draw an excessive amount of attention with clothing decorations. One of their widely used and accepted symbols, however, were actually crosses, which paid homage to the churches where punks would play shows and seek refuge, since religious buildings were protected and essentially untouchable by the state. The punk motto, "No Future," set originally by the infamous band the Sex Pistols, was meant to encapsulate the feeling of rejecting government and long-term success. But those in the East resented that, often feeling too much future. On the other side of the wall, everyone else seemed to have every freedom and opportunity at their fingertips, but a socialist government had strictly planned their futures. Despite the pride that Easterners often had for their unique take on punk, away from the commoditization of this emerging style in the capitalistic West, they did still crave the opportunity to get their hands on punk staples like leather goods and records. Very limited travel between the border was permitted, commonly to retired and elderly Germans. So punks would send grandma to the West with a list of goods to return home with. And since travel between East and West was sometimes permitted, Westerners who were daring enough to obtain a visa would dress in disguises to cross the border and search for those who appeared to be punk once on the other side. The look of punk, therefore, was essential in defining the social connections that continued to grow the alternative subculture throughout the years. While punk is normally talked about in the US and UK landscape, punk in Berlin definitely did not go unnoticed. In fact, David Bowie spent a considerable amount of time in the West, writing songs about his experience in the divided city, including Helden, or Heroes, which was a tribute to those who tried to escape the East. When all is said and done, it is often the punks and their ideals, from both sides, who are attributed with starting a revolution and helping to dismantle the oppressive government. Their culture broke down a social and physical barrier, giving Berlin its freedom. The years of fighting the system actually worked towards something great in this city. Even today, the style and ethos of punk lives on in Berlin. The streets are lined with graffiti art as a reminder of free expression that was once suppressed within the city. And artists, writers, musicians alike are unapologetically alternative in their styles, enjoying the abundance of music and art that emerged when the wall came down. Thanks for listening to an exploration of how social and political influences can work to develop a subculture in a physical and psychological way. I hope you enjoyed, and if you're interested in exploring more DEUTSCHEPUNK, check out the video and playlist linked here.